Streaming live on WFLA Now. Powered by 1-800-ASK-GARY.
And good afternoon, everybody. This is Max Defender 8 Chief Meteorologist Jeff Berardelli. And of course, you are looking at video of the destruction of Hurricane Ian, which unfortunately for us, our area was ground zero for the most costly storm in the world in 2022. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this segment. Not just Hurricane Ian, but also the other top global weather disasters of 2022. And you can read more about it, and you can see my segment on television yesterday by clicking on the link in this video or going to our website and the Climate Classroom section of the WFLA.com website. Now, to help me with this, I have one of the most esteemed and respected, if not the most respected meteorologist in the world, Dr. Jeff Masters, who has quite a resume. He was the founder of Weather Underground. Anyone who's a weather geek that's watching right now, you know of Weather Underground. He also was a hurricane hunter, flew into hurricanes, and he'll maybe tell us a story about how Hurricane Hugo almost killed him, apparently. I didn't know about that, but that's interesting. And I'm glad you're still here, by the way. And then lastly, he is a prolific writer for Yale Climate Connections, who I've also written many articles for in the past. And you really have to read his stuff. He really digs in, finds the applicable perspective, and is able to kind of put it down on paper so that, you know, to make these articles understandable. So, Dr. Jeff, welcome to the program. I appreciate you coming and visiting.
Hey, Jeff. Great to be talking with you.
So let's get right in. Let's talk about Hurricane Ian. I mean, this storm almost hit the Tampa Bay area square on. It ended up going just to the south, and unfortunately for the folks in Fort Myers, in that area, hit them directly. Although part of our viewing area here in the Tampa Bay area is, in fact, Sarasota County, east into Hardy, DeSoto, Highlands County, and southern Polk County, and we got hit very hard there. Hurricane Ian was a monster of a storm. One of the things that struck me about it as the storm moved in was the prolific amount of lightning that was produced in the eye wall. And it kind of gives you chills as a meteorologist to see that, because hurricanes are not usually prolific lightning producers. And when they are, we know there's a lot of vertical heat exchange going on between the ocean, or in this case, the Gulf of Mexico, and the storm. So tell me about your thoughts regarding Hurricane Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I flew into a bunch of hurricanes in my 4 years with the hurricane hunters, and I very rarely saw lightning, even in the couple Category 5 storms I flew into. So yeah, seeing all that lightning with Ian sure was an ominous sign. And it was traversing some of the warmest waters in the entire Atlantic, and these waters extended to great depth with warmth. And so it was sucking a lot of heat energy out of the ocean, converting it to the energy of its winds, that energy in the lightning you saw, the heavy rains that dumped, and the storm surge, of course, too.
Yeah, I mean, the rain was a more than a 1 in 1,000 year event. I say that just looking at the statistics. When I was, right when the storm was moving through, I took a look at those NOAA statistics, and it was something like, the 6-hour rainfall rates and the 12-hour rainfall rates you should see them less often than once every 1,000 years. We seem to be seeing a lot of those once in 1,000 year events. One thing I want to ask you more about is the water temperatures that it moved over. You can't get away from the fact that we seem to be seeing more of these destructive, powerful, major hurricanes, the Cat 3s, 4s, and 5s. And also the storm moving over, Florida Bay, which inherently is always a very warm patch of water. What's your feeling on the connection between a warmer climate and storms like Ian?
Hurricanes are heat engines that take heat out of the oceans and convert it to the kinetic energy of their winds. So if you increase the amount of energy available to it, the potential for them to grow stronger is going to increase. And certainly their potential to rapidly intensify is also going to increase. So we've been seeing a lot of this behavior in recent years. Since 2017, there have been now 7 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes that have hit the U.S., and you got to go way back to the early 1960s to see the last time we had that many Category 4 and 5s hit the U.S. So just a tremendous battering we've been taking. And part of that is very likely due to climate change causing increased ocean temperatures. Now, there's also a lot of natural variability in hurricanes. For instance, we went 2006 through 2016 without a single major hurricane hitting the US. So there's a lot of, variation in naturally, and a lot of extreme events occur naturally too. But climate change is certainly boosting the odds of extreme events like this, and we have to be prepared for more of the same.
So speaking of extreme events, we should probably transition now to other extreme events across the world. And one of those was, well, there were many heat waves, but the one that I chose here was the UK heat wave, where it reached 104 degrees, more than 104 degrees, which has never happened. This was a tremendous milestone. And it was a part and parcel of the hottest summer on record in Europe. And it wasn't just this year, right? A couple of years ago, we had just unbelievable heat in Central Europe. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the European drought and heat wave, that was a $20 billion plus disaster. And it's something that Europe has been seeing more of in recent years, these super expensive disasters. Last year, it was flooding, or I'm sorry, the previous year, it was flooding. 2021, they had a 20 billion plus flooding disaster, mostly in Germany and Belgium. Now, heat is energy, and when you put more heat into the system, when it happens to be dry, like it was last year in Europe, you're going to get more expensive and more intense droughts and heat waves. And when it happens to favor a wetter pattern like the previous year, well, there's more heat energy that's going to be evaporating moisture off the oceans, contributing to heavier rains. So you get a double whammy here. The heat is going to cause bigger disasters, no matter what kind of weather pattern is prevailing.
Yeah, and of course, research shows that Europe is warming up faster than much of the globe right now. And as we head into the future, Europe is projected to warm faster than much of the globe, with the exception, of course, of the poles.
Yeah, I mean, the poles are warming 4 times faster than the rest of the globe, but there are certain hotspots, Europe being one of them. The Middle East is another. I have great concern about the Middle East being a survivable place to live in coming decades.
All right. So, and by the way, the attribution study on the UK heat wave said that it would be virtually impossible for a heat wave of that magnitude, reaching 104 degrees, without human-caused climate change. So these things just basically could not have happened 100 years ago.
Yeah, we had one of those events in the Pacific Northwest the previous summer. Again, virtually impossible without climate change. I mean, Seattle, Portland, the whole rainforest getting over 100 for multiple days, that was not possible in the old climate.
And I think that you definitely get pushback from some folks saying, but this is just weather. Extreme weather happens. Okay, not to give away the fact that you're older than me, but you're just a couple years older than me. So you have a lot of perspective. You've been a meteorologist for a long time. So in your perspective, do you feel that things are more extreme, or it's just that we're seeing more stuff on our phones and on TV and so on and so forth?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, the weather is naturally extreme. And the climate I grew up in, though, back in the 70s and 80s, when I first became a meteorologist, that climate is gone. I mean, it's gotten so much more extreme and variable in recent years that I'm just blown away. I'm afraid to look at the latest computer model runs every day for fear of what I'm going to see. So, yeah, there's more people living in harm's way with more stuff driving increased damages, and there's more awareness due to people on social media. But the climate and the weather are definitely much more extreme. Maybe not in a way we can prove scientifically all the time, but the field of attribution study is coming along, and we're seeing that climate change has contributed significantly to a lot of these extremes.
Yeah, and as we talked about, these attribution studies often underdo the connection between climate change and extreme weather. And that's, partially because we don't necessarily have the tools that can kind of diagnose some of the attributes that are causing the more extreme weather, but also because climate scientists, or scientists in general, tend to be conservative.
Yeah, I mean, scientists can't prove all of what's going on based on our models because the models are imperfect. But we've seen time and time again these models, which do go under criticism by skeptics of climate change, the models have been underdoing things. So often we're seeing impacts far greater than we expected, far sooner than we expected. And the models are just a guide, just that. They're not giving us the full picture of what's going to happen and what is already happening.
All right, so let's move on to the next one, and that essentially is a part of the European heat, which is the European drought, worst drought in 500 years. But not just Europe. We also saw we're looking at the Rhine River there, which tremendous lows. That's China, which had a tremendous drought and heat wave. And of course, the American West this summer and fall, its worst drought conditions in 1,200 years. We're looking at, I think, Lake Powell there. So, this northern hemisphere drought, it wasn't just one country. It seemed to be all across the world. So what's going on? Let me ask you, is this related in any way to this triple dip La Nina? Or is it climate change, or is it both of those things? Is there something else going on?
Certainly, when you get a La Nina, you enhance drought conditions in some preferred parts of the world. Certainly, the Southwest U.S. is one. The Horn of Africa is another. They've had 5 consecutive dry seasons, which is unprecedented. And you also tend to get drought in parts of China. But on top of that, there has to be more going on, because we've had La Ninas through, the centuries and not seen this kind of behavior before. And there are a lot of climate model studies now showing that concurrent droughts, like we saw this summer, are more probable in a climate change world. You get a behavior of the jet stream where it tends to freeze in place with large extremes and contribute to drought conditions over multiple places we grow grain, unfortunately. Very bad year to have concurrent droughts, because we have a food crisis going on caused by the war in the Ukraine and the pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about concurrent droughts, because, this idea that climate change is fueling a more amplified at times jet stream and a more blocked jet stream. So once you have a pattern that kind of establishes itself, not only does it get amplified, it can also be amplified for a longer period of time. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it'll stay in place for days or even weeks sometimes, and it'll be very extreme at the same time. So it's extreme in 2 ways. Its magnitude and its duration.
What's amazing to me is the pictures of these rivers, because, this is starting to affect us economically, right? I mean, we're having problems shipping stuff down, not only the rivers in China, you're looking at China right there, the rivers in Europe, and the Mississippi River as well saw some problems this year. And obviously the U.S. West, I mean, now, of course, there's a deluge going on in California, but, and we can talk more about that coming up in a few minutes, but it really is incredible, the pictures of the rivers drying up this year. I can't remember ever seeing anything like that, especially in all different places all at the same time.
Yeah, on the Mississippi, it was particularly striking back in October to see the very low water levels. They were backing up barge traffic, these low water levels. 2,000 barges at one point couldn't ship grain because of the low water. And it's the second year in a row that barge traffic has been impacted on the Mississippi by an extreme weather event. The previous year, it was Hurricane Ida that took out the largest grain export port in the world, the port of South Louisiana, for multiple weeks because of the damage that the 150-mile-an-hour winds of that hurricane brought.
And when people ask me what I'm most concerned about as it pertains to climate change, I'm most concerned about instability in the world, international conflict, the lack of the resources that we're used to having at our beck and call that we may not have at our beck and call in the future. And we're already seeing these disruptions, and we're seeing how fragile our supply chain is. We saw that example set in COVID. We're seeing, on top of COVID, at the same time, you're dealing with war, conflict, and then on top of that, climate change and these more extreme weather events. And so the things that we're so used to having at our disposal becoming harder to come by. It's disrupting our economy. It's disrupting our geopolitics. That's what I'm most worried about as we move into the future. It's the things that we need not being available. So what happens? People like me and you, we're still eating, we're still drinking, but people who are in the poorest of poor countries, they no longer have the resources anymore because we're outbidding them.
Yeah, the drought that's concurrently going on in the Northern Hemisphere is extremely serious in that regard, because it's multiple impacts on supply chains. And I see drought as the number one issue with climate change in the near future, the next 10, 20 years, for exactly the reason you've talked about: supply chains, not enough food to feed people because we can't get it to them because there's interruptions.
Right, and migration. Now, a lot of the migration right now is internal displacement. I did a story years ago on, is when we had, I think it might have been Hurricane Ada. The two hurricanes that hit Honduras, within 15 miles of each other, within like 3 weeks of each other. Was it Zeta and Ada? I can't remember.
Iota and Ada.
Iota and Ada. Zeta couldn't have been Zeta.
Yeah.
And 500,000 people were displaced from their homes because of that. And of course, that caused people to surge towards the U.S. border. And that causes major political issues and the threat for conflict, too. So this is happening in real time. This is not just something we're thinking about and saying it's going to be 50 or 100 years from now. It is happening now. It's just that the media doesn't connect the dots very well.
Yeah, the migration crisis is absolutely driven by extreme weather in part, and also other factors, war, internal conflict, and so on. But as far as Central America goes, before the hurricanes caused that surge in migration, it was drought. They had a huge drought in, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua that drove migration just years before those two hurricanes.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's always multiple factors, right? It's not just one. If these countries could handle the amount of people that were rendered homeless by hurricanes, by the two hurricanes we talked about, Hurricane Ada, and these people, the countries had the resources to kind of house these people and feed these people, they wouldn't be forced out. So it's essentially a question of conflict in these areas. These people don't feel comfortable moving inside their own country because there's no place for them to go, and they're worried about their families moving to other parts of their nation, the lack of resources in that country. And so therefore they're displaced. So it's not just weather. And I want to be clear about that. It's not just climate or not just weather. Because people will bring up and push back against the fact that it's climate change. But the UN says that in the last decade, twice the amount of people have been displaced due to weather and climate as compared to conflict and war.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really a surprise. If you put more extreme weather in a growing poor population, you're going to displace a lot of people. I guess the good news we could point to is that the death toll from weather disasters has gone down significantly in recent decades. It's just that, we're getting more refugees now because we're saving lives, but we're not able to supply the other needs of these people.
All right, so I want to move on to the next one in the line of extreme weather that we saw. And if I can kind of pick my brain for a second, which one that was, is the floods in Pakistan. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Masters, nobody knows about this. And I say that because it was not covered very well in the media at all. But this could have been the most impactful weather and climate event of the year around the world. I mean, a tremendous amount of the country was flooded.
Yeah, I mean, the damages they're talking about are somewhere in the $30 billion range, which would be about 9% of the GDP of Pakistan. That's equivalent to a $2 trillion disaster in the U.S. Just mind-boggling impact on a country that doesn't have the resources to deal with it.
Yeah, something like 10% or more of the country was flooded, which is about the size of South Carolina, just for the folks who are watching, to give you a perspective on how much land was flooded. I understand some of the country still flooded from monsoons. And I do wonder, is there a La Nina component here? Obviously, we know there's a climate change component. If it's warmer, you're going to have bigger floods.
Yeah, the monsoon tends to be increased in years of La Nina, and it goes down in years of El Nino. So this is to be expected. You'd get extra rains in a La Nina year, but to this magnitude, boy, that's something else. They had it like this in 2012 as well. Not quite as bad, but still a catastrophe.
Okay, and then the last one I want to bring up, you've already talked about, the Horn of Africa. This breaks my heart. It really does. I saw a story done by one of the national media outlets on what's going on right now in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa. We're used to seeing people, unfortunately, starving in this part of the world and lacking, water. But this is beyond the disasters that we've seen in the past in many ways. The NASA says this is the worst drought on record in the Horn of Africa. The UN, it is a major humanitarian issue, what's going on there. Again, we touched on the fact that La Nina, we tend to see more drought in the Horn of Africa. We know that climate change is contributing to this as well. We're looking at some pictures of some of the children that are affected. I mean, there's so much going on in the world. It's so tough to care about everything that's going on. But when we look at these children, me being a new dad, I'm a dad of a little girl who's just over a year old. It is so difficult to see what's going on. These children are dying because they don't have water and food.
Yeah, as far as the humanitarian impact goes, this is the #1 disaster in the past year in the world. Something like 21 million people in need of food assistance, and imminent need or imminent danger of experiencing famine this coming April and May if food assistance doesn't continue to arrive there.
And of course, part of that is not just climate change, the war in Ukraine and some of the grain not getting there. And again, it's not just the grain's not going there, it's that other places are outbidding. They can't afford to bring the grain to that area because other countries are saying, well, we need it as well, and we're going to pay you twice as much. So that's what's happening with the market.
That's the problem when you have concurrent droughts worldwide, like we did this past year. There's a lot of need for food that usually is not present when you have a good bumper crop. So a lot of competition, and the rich countries are going to outcompete the poor ones.
And that is something that we probably are going to see more of in the future. So I'm going to ask you about one more big event, and then I'm probably going to have to move on from that. And I do want to ask you about what you think the future portends. So let's talk about the West African flood. So we saw the crazy drought in the eastern part of Africa. What about the West African floods, Nigeria, in that area?
Yeah, Nigeria and Niger had their deadliest floods on record this past summer. A very bountiful monsoon, and it came a year after they had a very severe drought. So they went from intense drought to intense flooding, the kind of weather whiplash that we're seeing with California, for instance, right now. And these are situations you expect to see with climate change. You put more heat into the system, you're going to have more intense droughts in dry conditions. When it happens to be wet, you're going to have more intense flooding.
Right. What I want to talk about is now what you think the future holds. So, we've seen these extremes come kind of more fast and furious than we maybe anticipated. So what do we think is going to be happening in the decades to come?
I would very much like to say this is just a temporary period of extreme weather, and it'll pass. We'll be back to a stable climate. But, it's not going to happen. It's going to accelerate the impacts on the climate. Things are going to get more intense soon. And, we're just beginning to see now what the climate is capable of. And it's going to continue getting more extreme, particularly in ways we're not used to seeing, 1,000-year floods, 1,000-year droughts, that kind of thing. And I kind of look at the whole situation, maybe an analogy that would resonate with some is the explorer John Wesley Powell, when he started going down the Colorado River back in the 1860s. He said, "We are now ready to start our way down the great unknown. We have an unknown distance yet to run, an unknown river to explore. What falls there are, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not." And so we can think of it similarly with the climate. We're riding a pretty crazy rapids, turbulent river, and I can hear the next waterfall, and it's a big one. Yeah. And the one after that, maybe even bigger. And, the people that are controlling the boat, maybe the rich decision makers, want to keep on partying on, saying there's nothing wrong and the river's not getting more intense, but it is, and our boat is leaking. And we better fix it. We have to deal with the situation. Acknowledge there is something we can do about it.
Hey, Dr. Jeff, I lost the last 15 seconds or so of what you said. Everything else is clear. You just broke up a little bit towards the end there.
Okay. You want me to repeat it?
The last 15 seconds or so.
Yeah. I mean, we're riding on a river of climate change, and the river is getting more turbulent, more rapid, and the falls ahead are getting louder. I can hear them coming now. And boy, we better do something to acknowledge the fact that we are in a climate that is changing. Humans are responsible. The impacts are now, and there is stuff we can do to improve the situation. We can stop burning fossil fuels. We can adjust to the new extreme climate that we have now.
Right. Yeah. And, the economy is on our side to some degree with the amount of decrease we've seen in renewable energy in terms of the cost of it. It seems as though there's momentum for essentially a change to green energy because everything is so much cheaper now. Not to say it's a solve all, because it's not. I mean, eventually we'll realize that we're using too many of those resources and we'll have to, change again. But this is just essentially one step in changing the way we do stuff. Now that we have more knowledge than we had in the past, just acknowledging, hey, we did great things, but there's some things that are not working exactly the way we need them to, and we have to right this ship, and here's how we do it. It's easier said than done.
It is exciting to see the clean energy revolution, and it's unstoppable at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm highly confident that we are going to come through the climate crisis in a new, society that has adjusted to the new climate, not without a lot of losses. And
growing pains.
We're going to lose a lot that is precious.
Right. One more thing I want to ask you about, and then we can, I don't know if there'll be any questions or not, but I do want to ask you about the California situation right now. So, of course, the West has been an incredible drought since about 2000. Now, there have been some very wet periods in that time, but the majority of the time it's been very, very dry over the last 22 years or so. The driest it's been in essentially the driest 22-year period in 1,200 years. But now, all of a sudden, we're getting hit really hard. Now, this is the kind of climate that we have along the West Coast. It's typical to go from drought to deluge there. But these extremes are even more extreme than what we would consider normal.
Yeah, and particularly the heavy rain that they're getting now is falling on hillsides that have been burned by some of the record wildfires California's had in recent years. So they're getting worse debris flows and more danger to their watersheds from, some of this fire damage to hillside sliding into it. Moreover, the precipitation is falling more as rain now than as snow, like it used to in previous decades. So the water's hitting the watersheds faster, causing more flooding problems.
And less of it is going into the reservoirs.
That's right. It just runs off and doesn't do any good. And they do need it to replenish the groundwater, which has been overpumped.
Right. Okay. Well, listen. Any other things you want to discuss? I know there were other extremes. One of them was the 1 in 1,000 year floods that happened across the Ohio Valley. We didn't even get to that. I mean, it's been so extreme this year that some of them we just can't have time to get to. But is there anything else you want to mention before we close this out?
It was only between the 5th and 6th warmest year on record last year, and we had a credible number of extremes. I think this year is going to be warmer, so the potential exists to have an even crazier year for extremes in 2023.
We're likely to transition, I guess we'll see, but we're likely to transition to an El Nino. We'll see if that transpires or not. If it does, it would only be probably a half the year, not the whole year. But if we do get a full El Nino year, you can imagine that easily being the hottest year on record that we've ever seen.
It could be, but on the good side for you guys there in Florida is it will damp down on hurricane season. We've had a lot of extreme hurricane seasons in recent years. Be nice to have a quiet one.
Yes, from your mouth to God's ears, that's for sure. Yeah. Well, Dr. Jeff Masters, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And for the folks who've been watching from home or wherever you are, thank you again for tuning in. If you want to read more about or see the video that I produced yesterday for television, you can go to WFLA.com. There is a link in this video right here, the top 5 global weather disasters of 2022. Thank you for joining me. I'll be trying to do these climate and weather segments at least once a week, so I hope you'll tune in to hear more about what is really interesting science. Thank you, everybody.